Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, and I am joined again, but many of you probably come on board to my channel in the time after I've spoken to Tim, probably 4 times previously, something like that. We have spoken a number of times, and you will all know from looking at my daily hits and losses videos and my military aid and geopolitics videos, I often use Tim White as a source for some of the claims that I make. He features as one of my many sources, and he is something of an analyst, expert on Ukraine. He'll give you a reintroduction for those who don't know him, no doubt, after my preamble. But I'm really happy to be joined by him again today. And we're going to talk. I don't have any set questions for today. I think we're just going to go around the houses, talk about what our views on the war in Ukraine are presently and what the future looks like. But anyway, Tim, thanks for coming back on again. Introduce yourself to those who might not know you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Delighted to be back here. We've taken a while trying to set this up, haven't we? Availability has been difficult on both sides, travel and work and all sorts, but great to be back. Thanks for those who already know who I am. So I'll try to keep this short. I've worked in Ukraine an awful lot. I've been employed by media stations. I've been employed by universities. I've done some fact-checking and fact-checking training as well. Worked with Stop Fake for many years. And also made quite a few documentaries out there now. I think it's about 6, something like that, including the first one that was distinctly about fact-checking and fake news around the time the Prigozhin's factories were underway in St. Petersburg to try and brainwash foreigners, as well as his own people within Russia, and strengthen Putin's hand for the actions that he wanted to do. So since then, I have been back to Ukraine since war broke out, but I am based in the UK, but I still have friends, a lot of contacts there, contacts inside the military, and also less than I would like, but I have some contacts at some parts of the government as well. There's my page. Thank you very much, Jonathan. So follow me on Twitter if you want, and the name is the handle is in my tag as well on the screen that you should be seeing as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, always good to talk to you and get your view on things. So I guess, when we last spoke, my goodness, don't know when that was, but I'm sure we've had the US supplemental since then. That whole 7 months of waiting for that came, and now we've had news that all the rest of that funding has gone Ukraine's way, although that's been pledged. We don't know what that's going to look like. There's $8.8 billion worth of potential kit that they'll get, but Ukraine is still in a very precarious situation. We've had the Kursk offensive there, which I think was a really good idea and I think has gone well, all things considered. I'd like to know what your viewers are on that. And then we've got the East, which is very precarious for the Ukrainians, but my personal opinion is that the Russians are throwing everything they can at the Ukrainians and are on a very precarious position themselves, with not having that much in reserve, and they are just trying to steal people and equipment from everywhere they can. And then we have all the other elements of the war. What are your thoughts in general about, say, Kursk, the Eastern Front, and the military lines as we see them?
Okay. Yeah, I think the first thing to say is you mentioned US right at the beginning. US have been huge benefactors of Ukraine in many ways. Don't believe all the top line figures that come out, because, for instance, when they say 8 billion or whatever, just pick a figure out of thin air, that is the cost that the US has for getting replacement weapons, missiles, ammunition. So that's how much it's going to cost them. But they would replace them anyway, and actually destroying the older equipment costs quite a lot of money as well. So it's enabling the US to make jobs. It's enabling the US to get rid of their old weapons and ammunition and upgrade at the same time. So the actual cost of the US is way less than that, which I think should be more regularly explained to the taxpayer and primarily to the voter, because
I spend my life explaining that. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's never, you can't repeat it too many times, can you? That the headline figure looks great, but it's actually, well, the US would probably spend at least half of that anyway, just as a matter of course, upgrading, replacing, possibly even more. So there are some shipment costs, but there are also disposal costs that they don't have to pay for. So yeah, we have quite an important election coming up that Ukraine is as interested in as probably you and I are as politics buffs as well as everyone in the US as well. And there is a lot that we can maybe, if we've got time, get onto about that a lot of people are worried about for obvious reasons, as anyone who's taken the trouble to tune in now will obviously know. With regard to the operation, I think it needs to be said that the times that Ukraine has been in crisis, if you want to use that word, have come at the times when the US has slowed or stopped or not fully supplied. For instance, when the Republicans were holding up the vote for, as you said, was it 6 months or so, and eventually the vote went through, and eventually the pledge was made to Ukraine. But again, it takes a lot of time, and I think generally Ukraine has been disappointed at the flow of weapons, the promises, even like the F-16s. They come in dribs and drabs. They don't come when they say they will happen. And all this money that's being pledged, some of it comes very well and reliably, and some of it doesn't. Even like the Czech initiative, which was brilliant for ammunition, didn't all arrive when it said it would, when it was needed on the front line. And Ukraine has been pushed back because it hasn't had the ammunition. It hasn't been able to push on when it has had certain advantages on the battlefield as much as it would like. And the one area where it has obviously done well was the incursion into Kursk, which was a huge surprise, which I'm not sure that the US or Britain and other allies even knew about, because it was so secretive. They were scared of leaks, and they were scared of being told, no, don't do that, otherwise we won't supply, blah, blah, blah. It was very well done in that Russia was so arrogant, again, as we've seen previously, it just doesn't protect its borders, as the various legions, Free Russia Legion, etc., has proven in the past. And the fact that they managed to take a substantial chunk of that land that you're now highlighting was fantastic, in that Russia did have to redeploy forces. Now, some came from outside the arena itself of Ukraine. They flew various people back from Africa, from Syria. They got some equipment back elsewhere. They depleted Kaliningrad, although I still want to call it Königsberg. But anyway, that's another matter. And I think that it served its purpose. However, one of the main purposes is to give a negotiating chip for the negotiations, which almost everyone sees are coming now. So it's vital that Ukraine holds on to that. What I will say is that I agree. Because so much has been put into that offensive, I know it has left battalions, personal experience and people I've spoken to, critically short of being able to defend in Donetsk. And that's one of the reasons why Ukraine's front has crumbled a little bit, and why there's been the biggest progress that Russia has made in Donetsk for probably since the very first days of the war, I would think, including 2014, actually.
Yeah, and there's been all this talk about the number of reserves that Ukraine does or doesn't have, like trained up, and they're still training. There's a whole unit, 2,300 troops being trained in France and being equipped wholly with French equipment. You've got Operation Interflex in the UK. You've got all these. And mobilization has improved, right? So, and in fact, we heard today from, was it Podolyak or someone was saying, actually, we are starting to see some success in rotating troops. So I was thinking that Ukraine was trying to hold on as long as possible on the Eastern Front, knowing that the only place that they could sensibly use, say, however many troops they used up in Kursk, 5,000, 10,000, whatever it is, that has achieved much more than putting those same troops on the Eastern Front that would have maybe slowed down, but it wouldn't have given them territory. It wouldn't have retreated the Russians as much, or certainly had achieved any kind of territorial gain, so on and so forth. So I think Kursk was a real success for all the reasons you've mentioned, and many more actually. And I think that the Ukrainians were just kind of waiting until those trained, mobilized troops or volunteer troops are going to be able to come through from training and then start to rotate on the Eastern Front. But it's like, where do you go next? What's going to take place in the next 6 months over the winter and spring periods?
Yeah, my main fear is, and I've voiced this before, and I have absolutely concrete sources on this who don't want to be identified. Probably you can understand the reasons why. When the biggest problem has been that there is no definitive, some people call it Imagine 09, but it's different to that now. There have to be high quality fallback places, and Ukraine tries to defend a town, And their MO seems to be purely defend as long as we can, kill as many Russians as we can, erase as much enemy equipment as we can, and then fall back. But then there are not better defenses. And sometimes you lose places that you just can't afford to lose. I mean, Vuhledar is, a lot was made of that, but there are even more important places. Pokrovsk obviously is still really important. Chasiv Yar, high ground, really important, because you're not just conceding a small town, you're actually conceding all the lands around it, because they're just indefensible there. It's bad enough having Russia within striking distance and having fire control of the supply routes in and out, but that's a real problem. And there has been some appalling examples that I've been given and told not to publish of really horrible defenses that have been, money has been wasted on them because they're not real defenses. Some of the elementary construction elements of battle have been just flagrantly ignored. It looks like cowboys building, and there are no ways that the battalions can properly defend some of these places. And it's a disgrace. It's a crying shame when we're donating as governments and as individuals as well. I'm sure so many people listening will have donated to various causes, and there is still I mean, it's nowhere near on the scale of Russia, and there's corruption in our country, but there is corruption in Ukraine as well. And some contracts are being handed out far too readily to people who don't have the requisite skills and experience in warfare construction and management. Some of the leadership needs to be blamed. I've said that on my Twitter feed this morning as well, because if you're retreating from a place, you have to know that the next place you're going to is equally or better defensible. You've had time to back up, and when you fall back and the positions are worse than when you've just tried to defend, then that really hits morale, really does. And you've lost colleagues on the way out and things like that. I mean, Vuhledar, for me, they should have escaped and retreated far earlier, but the decision was taken that they could still destroy Russian equipment, accepting that quite a few Ukrainians would be lost, captured or killed. And I don't think for a country with finite resources and that protects its people, that was an acceptable decision to me. But I don't know everything that goes on the front line, obviously. I do hear when there are complaints from certain people who are involved in the war directly.
Yeah, the way I understand it, and again, this could be wrong, is that the Ukrainians have done some pretty decent fortifications on the southern Zaporizhia frontline area, and actually just down here behind Vuhledar and Kharkiv, just sort of over here. But where it's not been good is particularly the Pokrovsk Avdiivka area, and that is, of course, where the Russians did particularly well, ostensibly because there weren't the fortifications in place, plus they were using aviation guided glide bombs to great effect in that area, and as such, I think the Ukrainians were not expecting to have lost Avdiivka in the way that they did, and the Russians, they basically capitulated because the Russians used aviation and plus came under some tunnels and did a few funky things, and then there was nothing. They had not built that stuff then, and then as they were retreating, they were trying to build it, but then it was building it in the wrong places, and it was all a little bit too little too late, and it's just been a bit of a disaster, that particular area, sort of Pokrovsk and the kind of wider region there. That's how I understand it, but as I say, could be wrong.
I would just say, well, I will quote someone again who I can't name, who said to me very recently, Zaporizhia is a disaster. Just wait. Remember what happened in Vovchansk, in Kharkiv, and when you saw the dragon's teeth that were just scattered at the side of the road. And those are the sorts of defenses we're talking about. And then, lo and behold, the first semi-push from Russia, they were already straight into Levadny, which they claim to have occupied. Still haven't had official word from Ukrainian sources yet, but it does look like another village that was in the deep state map yesterday, well under Ukrainian control, with another kilometre or two. And now it looks to have been lost. There's been a surge there, and there's just not adequate defences, not able to defend for Ukrainians. So it makes me worry about the Zaporizhia front in particular.
Yeah, because as I say, that was the one that was supposed to be really, really well built. However, there are differences between existing front lines and then the deeper. So I would assume that the decent fortifications will have been built, because this is quite a long-term front line. So you're not going to get construction of trenches within sort of 30 kilometers of that. So when you're talking about decent front lines, it would be behind that. But those that I just think that there are probably so many places the Russians could attack if they had the forces, because everyone's spread really thinly, and that's the same for both sides. It's just, I'm sure the whole front line is a lot more brittle than we think.
Yeah, and I mean, look at that map. There's so much front line. There's so much to defend. It is extremely difficult, of course, to even think about defending all the front line. It's possibly one of the biggest front lines we've ever seen in any battle in history, certainly in modern warfare. And for a country with such limited resources, having lost for a greater part of the war so much of its export opportunity, and still well down on what it should be, having lost so much of its crops that are in the fertile Kherson region, having lost so much of its natural minerals in the east, and the mining and the metallurgy, which is now at real risk as well. It's in some respects incredible that Ukraine has kept going, but we know the spirit of the Ukrainian people and the historical fight for freedom. They know how much freedom means to them and their forefathers. And so in that regard, I wasn't surprised. And also the West has at least stepped up, if not wholly, partially, and in rather in dribs and drabs. But I still maintain that this war could have been over within the first year had we taken the initiative and dared to believe and done even what we're doing now in the first year in terms of supplying arms and backing 100%. And had we tightened up on the sanctions and implemented them, all of them, made end user agreements on everything, not just on military hardware, then I think Russia would have been suffocated by now. But one point you made earlier and just touched on was that how much of a struggle it is for Russia. And I get a lot of people, mainly trolls, but some people who seem to be quite educated, writing to me saying that, well, Russia is clearly winning, they're advancing, Russia's not retreating anywhere. And broadly, that's true. However, it is a race against time, as you say. And I think that Russia has accepted now that there are two ways that this war ends. One, with maybe a peace negotiation, which may happen after the US election, particularly strengthens the hand of the West if Kamala Harris wins the election. However, the other way is if the West more or less capitulates, which may happen if Trump gets in. So Russia's trying to get as much land, as you said, now at all costs, human costs, equipment costs, everything. And its economy is in a really, really fragile state. They still can't control inflation, despite the fact that interest rates are up at 20% now. They still have real trouble. They just hide bodies and don't pay out. They're having to pay a lot of money. So they're pretty much printing money, which is helping inflation grow further. And the economy and the figures are based purely on the defense industry. And when you're cutting spending on health by a third, when you're cutting spending on maintaining infrastructure projects, it has a huge effect on national morale. And it has a huge effect on people's pockets. And when the roads, we know how much we complain about in the UK about the roads not being repaired, to the nth degree, the complaints that we have about roads, about health, and probably that other people in other nations are thinking as well, hugely different. And while we see all these pictures of people dining out nicely in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, yep, that's true. It still goes on. They have their lives. The middle classes are still broadly unaffected, but it's creeping towards that stage where the middle classes are having their lives changed and the sanctions are biting in various aspects. Transport's not as safe. How many mystery fires do we see? How many aircraft do we see with emergency landings or even crashing? So gradually society is changing. And we've started to see in the opinion polls, I think that you'll have noted, that opinion is turning against being in favor of the war, if not wholly outrightly against. It's certainly not in favor as much of the war.
38% to 28% in that recent poll where they said the war is making, is doing more good than harm. That it was only 38%, which was, not a great amount in May 2023. And the latest one is 28%. So they've lost 10% there. And again, you can think that is a benchmark kind of minimum, that actually the real stats will probably be worse for the Russians there.
How many people would dare to
Yeah,
say the real reason when you're speaking potentially to a stranger, be it on phone or in the street, they might have a badge.
yeah.
But even the Levada Center, you'd think, well, I'm sure that the KGB and FSB must be still
On
on
them, yeah.
probably have their own agents doing their own survey and marking down people. So I'd be reticent to give the truth if I was giving an opinion to someone in the street or on the phone I didn't know, even if they said they were in Estonia or wherever.
But I think there really is, and I don't want to sound too like copium, etc. But like you're saying, Russia are in a much worse position than I think many people give them credit for being in, or uncredit for being in. So you have basically two options. One option is that Russia are doing really well. They're doing fine. The other option, I mean, I'm making this binary for simplicity's sake. So you've got two theses. One is Russia doing really well. Good job, well done. And the other is, oh shit, things are looking pretty bad. I think Russia are in trouble, right? And then you look at all these data points, and it's always a case of like this is called abductive reasoning to the inference to the best explanation. So what explains the data points better? So we split it to these binary. Is it that Russia are doing really well or Russia are doing really badly? And you say, right, Russia are getting North Korean soldiers to help them. What does that tell you? Russia are using buggies and motorcycles on the front line. What does that tell you? Russian troops are not being trained very well and don't have the requisite equipment. What does that tell you? Russia have a labor shortage, etc. Like each one of these things, yes, they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at the front lines and they're grinding through these gains territorially. But when you see like 15 vehicles destroyed in one spot, and when X, Y, and Z, and every single one of these data points suggests that Russia are in a very precarious position, but they're just holding on because they're able to scrape together these people. They're literally stealing people from other countries. Like you said before, if they are drawing people in from Niger or Mali in order to support the Kursk incursion, if they drafted 50,000 people and now Chasivyar hasn't been taken by the end of summer, then what does this tell you about the situation of the Russians? Yes, there are some successes, but the macro picture for me, and when you take into account all of those economic indicators, things are troubling for the Russians, and it's just like, who is going to break first?
Yeah. And also the thing that's being stored up, of course, as I see in the UK news recently, we've been talking about the falling birth rate, and it's again way worse in Russia, and they didn't have enough people to start with. They hadn't even thought of what would happen when they unofficially declared war or special military operation and conscription, and the millions left. And okay, some have come back, but losing so many men, and it's almost exclusively men at the front. Again, and just to be very, very harsh about it, a lot of disabled people who won't be able to have families as well coming back from the war, psychologically traumatic, as well as the, I was going to call it petty crime. That's not wrong. The petty criminals who've come back and are also suffering from PTSD and committing other murders, discontent in society. The birth rate is really low, which is why they've started passing ridiculous laws, knowing that the next generation...
Gilead and The Handmaid's Tale, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the manpower shortage now, and it's going to get worse because there aren't the 18-year-olds coming through now that there were. And now the birth rate is so low. And who will want to go back to Russia of all those who've fled? Very few. And how many Westerners will want to go there despite the inducements that are being offered? A handful of idiots. They are useful idiots. And that's it. And still the flow continues, either through deaths, and the deaths will increase through lack of healthcare provision because the hospitals aren't being invested in, because a lot of the best brains are leaving, or some of the best brains, and the deaths at the front where they're even using skilled personnel now. And so in another 18 years, there won't be that replacement for the ones who've been dying and the older generation. So it's been on a gradual decline for quite a while. If you look at the workforce availability in Russia, particularly among the male population, and that's going to fall off a cliff now. It started already falling off a cliff with the deaths of the combatants, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And then you add on to other problems like, well, who's going to pay for the pension, and what age must the pension go to, because they don't have enough people working. And it's got to, the elderly society is broadly escaping this war, but they're going to live to quite a long age, even for Russia, and there's going to be not enough people paying taxes. So it's another real pressure point on the economy, and that will cause widespread discontent if they suddenly have to hike the pension age up another few years. We saw some already minor protests in places, but all this, the body bags returning, the mothers who are getting so angry will eventually speak out. We've had the first murmurings with the protests on the Saturday afternoons that are still going on. They can only grow despite the clampdown. There comes a time when, as a parent grieving, what else have I got to lose? What else have I got to lose? I've got to say what I believe in. And there will eventually be the threshold that is passed when it'll be a balancing act. And I think it'll be the little boy with his finger in the dam. And when Putin's finger's removed, there will be a real flood of people telling the truth, expressing their anger, daring to come out on the streets. And I wait for that time with glee, because that'll be the start of the end. The other option is to collapse from within anyway. There might be a coup, although Putin's very carefully over 25 years surrounded himself just with yes men and people who aren't a threat, people who aren't exactly the brightest, because he wants to be the most intelligent around.
Razumov and Shoigu are there precisely because they're not really that good, to some degree.
Exactly. And when someone started showing a bit too much ability and independence, mysteriously their plane falls out of the sky.
Yeah, who knew? I think JR here, Jeroen Roloff, says attrition. I'll take this one stage further. So he's absolutely right. The one who runs out first will in the end lose. That's why help from the West is so important. They need stuff to counter the Russian advances, like more people too. And he goes on. But it's not just attrition in terms of personnel and military hardware, although that's obviously super important militarily, but it's attrition of the economy. And this is where you're like, okay, what do each side have? So Russia has more human beings and they had more equipment. So Ukraine had to work very hard to attrit Russian personnel and equipment at rates that reflect them being able to kind of prevail when they have less of everything. So you combat mass with precision, with better technology, with better tactics, and they've been doing a really good job of that. Of course, some mistakes are made, etc., etc. But actually, the attrition rates have been really very good. But how long can each side go on? Russia are running out of stuff. Now, that's when it gets really worrying that Russia are able to then draw on North Korea and potentially China. So I think I said at the beginning of the war, the only way that Russia can prevail in this war is if China comes on board and helps them militarily. Now, Belousov is right now in Beijing, and that he's the Russian defense minister. That is worrying. We've got North Korea possibly coming on board. That is worrying, because at the moment, Ukraine are kind of winning the attrition war, even though it's desperately bad for them. Now, the economic war, like you said, there are loads of indicators say Russia are in trouble. And actually, when you look at the combined economies and the GDP of all the allies of Ukraine, Ukraine should be able to prevail in this war. It just does depend on the political will of all these people. And that's when it's, everyone's worrying about November the 5th in the US, because that will define the political will of the allies in general. And so you've got these two areas, military area that was looking good for Ukraine, but there could be some worries with China and North Korea. And then you've got the economic scenario where, yes, Russia's GDP is improving, but that is because they're just building more and more military stuff. But in general, that belies a really desperate situation economically for them. And that's kind of where we are. Any thoughts on all of that drivel?
I agree entirely. I mean, it brings you back to the ridiculous word that has been, I think, the key word of the uneducated and the scared. And those are two attributes that don't win any war, and that is escalation. The amount of times we've heard this stupid word, drivel, particularly, I have to say, from the White House and from Jake Sullivan. Goodness me, I wish someone had had the ability to replace him, because I think he is influencing Biden. And as I said, the US has lacked, might have given a lot in the end, but it's taken so long and hasn't acted quickly enough. And it's about acting with surprise. I mean, everything has been so well telegraphed and taken so long to get through that the US has eventually supplied things, but that Russians have already taken proactive action to make sure that's not the case. I mean, even looking back to how much warning we gave of the counterattack and how they built 3 lines of defense. And I dare say that those 3 lines of defense were unfortunately worse than the defensive lines that Ukraine had. And this is in occupied territory. And it's just at times been a shambles, a lack of coordination. And this risk of escalation is pathetic when you say, well, if that's escalation, then for instance, a point I've made numerous times. Obviously, North Koreans supplying people, supplying weapons, China supplying weapons, probably Iran definitely supplying weapons again. And if that's escalation, then I'm scratching my head. Why can't we escalate?
So this is a really good point. So Friedrich Merz, the possible next chancellor of Germany, who's in charge of the CDU at the moment. So CDU being the centre-right party, at the moment you've got a centre-left coalition. And if you forget like the AfD on the far right and the BSW on the far left who are pro-Russian, you basically got pro-Ukraine in the kind of establishment parties. Now, Friedrich Merz has come out and said, well, we should be, essentially he said, to paraphrase, we should be the ones setting the red lines. So if Russia keep hitting civilians, then we should lift restrictions on the foreign deep into Russia. And if they keep hitting civilians, then we should supply tourists. I'm like, yes, thank you. That's actually totally right. I've been banging on for ages that we should be setting red lines for Russia, not them for us. Like, I don't understand why we dance to Russia. Oh, we can't do that just in case they did. No, if you, Russia, do this, then we will provide this to Ukraine.
And it's just disgusting that potentially US has tried to stop allies giving weapons because they contain US components or allowing them to be used deep inside Russia. And at the same time, many of those same components have found their way via Turkey or via Kazakhstan into Russia, and they're used in the weapons that are sent deep into Ukraine. And that makes me really angry that the components are not being controlled. And I know that's very difficult, but you can ensure it or do your best to ensure it with end user agreements that no resale allowed, and then prosecute the governments for allowing this to happen, take sanctions against the national government for not taking further action. And yeah, it might hit trade in the short term, but in the long term, everyone will benefit because the war will come to a close quicker. But where is the logic for the US reportedly to say, I'm sorry, France, you can't use your scouts because they've got some US components in it, and maybe the same to Britain. And then at the same time, those same components, or very similar, in missiles that are now undoubtedly being used more than ever.
Yeah, that's why I think
Ukrainian people, not just military targets.
Yeah, that's why I think the anti-escalation argument is probably the one that's really going on behind the scenes. Goose Springsteen says, thanks for the stream, guys. Really appreciate the work you both do. So thanks, Goose. That's really kind of you. He also then goes on to say, and thank you very much for this, Goose, in a worst case scenario where Trump wins in November and withdraws support to pressure Ukraine to negotiate, what is the danger that the rest of NATO will also withdraw support, believing Ukraine cannot resist without US aid? Fascinating question, and I'll add a bit of context to that, is that we hear in the Politico article that I've discussed today in a video I just released before this, so most of you won't have seen it, but Viktor Orban is apparently working in cohorts with Donald Trump in order to, because the aid underwritten by the frozen Russian assets to repay back the loan, that loan with the EU is actually with the EU and the US and like UK and other entities as well. And Viktor Orban's stopping that from happening, and he's stopping that from happening until after the election, so that it's a political gift to Trump. So Politico has just written a big article on this. So if you are still someone who thinks Trump's the best option for Ukraine, you've got Viktor Orban very clearly telling you that that's not the case, and his best mate Trump is he's giving this gift which is stopping aid to Ukraine. It's just crazy. Anyway, so the question, Tim, is what do you think will happen if Trump gets in realistically, and do you think he will pull out of NATO, and will NATO continue to support Ukraine?
Just want to pick up on the Orban and the Politico, because it's not actually new. This came out of the summit last week, where the EU ambassadors passed the deal, but not with the restrictions, the sanctions that were agreed upon by all parties. So the US saying and NATO saying that it was contingent on this money, this 8 billion, I can't remember which, I'm getting my figures mixed up, 50 million, wasn't it?
35 billion euros, and then you hear different amounts of what that is in dollars, and then there are different, there are lots of different numbers.
Yeah, it's supposed to be up to 50 billion, $50 billion, I think, from that mainly has come from various sources, but the releasing of the what they're able to release from the Russian assets was a large part of this. But it was all contingent on them continuing the restrictions and passing them for 36 months, I think.
That's correct.
And
yeah.
that was what Orban and his entourage refused, knowing that that was going to be the stumbling block for the US and NATO to also agree. Now, Orban may be pro-Russian, may not be. He may be doing playing what I call the Indian card, in that he's still very nicely got his position with Hungary within the EU, still got his nice position within NATO and having a veto, and at the same time knowing that if it goes wrong for the EU and NATO, then he's going to pick up the real benefit of the money, the contracts, the kickbacks, even if he's not getting them at the moment, from Russia. So it leaves Hungary in a good position. If it all goes wrong, he's still a member of these two fascinating clubs that still give him a lot of money and still support Hungarian society. So what is there to lose to take this alternative option? And it shows the problems we have with democracy, and particularly with a multi-nation organization. I'm coming back to Goose's point, where just one country has a veto and can stop the other 27.
Yeah, there is a problem with the unanimity form of voting, and this is why the EU have now realised this and are trying to think of ways around this. And even going forward,
that's why the 36-month thing was put in place, that the restrictions would still last even if Trump got in. They're trying to Trump-proof everything, trying to get the funding in the US that has been passed sorted for the foreseeable future, so we're not leaving Ukraine hanging again, even if Trump gets in. I have to wonder whether that legislation can be rewritten, and whether somehow the president can sign a decree to stop what has already been agreed and passed by a previous president and administration. But maybe we'll come to that after November. Hopefully we won't, but I have fears that Elon Musk's going to deluge all media with a huge amount of cash to try and get himself a position in government, which shouldn't be allowed, but that's another point. And I think that could genuinely turn the tables. And I think we have to see what has been achieved by SpaceX was incredible, and I thought it was an incredible video, but all these little things play into the public mind. I don't think the timing was coincidental on that. Right in the lead up to the election, Trump now allying himself, particularly with Musk, and Musk pulling out this masterstroke that shows just how powerful his company can be and how they're going to represent the US, blah, blah, blah. So I think we should be skeptical about everything. And we certainly cannot discount a Trump presidency, terrible though it sounds. And I just don't understand. But having been to the US and seen perfectly sane people telling me, black people, young people, Jewish people telling me they're going to vote for Trump, I'm just scratching my head at what has happened to that country, I'm afraid. Still a lot of sane people, thankfully. But coming back to Goose's point, yeah, there is a real danger of that, because there will be other countries within, like Hungary, Italy potentially, although Giorgia Meloni has been very strong, has been a much better leader than I think most of us imagined on various aspects, considering her background. They still won't allow weapons to be used. And so I think we'll develop into a north-south split, take Canada out of the equation and put the US in, if you like, with in the NATO aspect with the south. And then you will have the Mediterranean countries, Greece, you will have the Hungary, some of the other nations roundabout there. I think Romania will stay fairly strong. And then you'll have the Nordic nations, the Baltic states and the UK, who are very still, and Poland, pro stopping Russia. And the others will be a little bit like, well, and then when you get to 4 or 5 nations within a bloc having a contrary point of view, that is a huge problem. And Trump knows that. And he knows that the US is still the ringmaster in NATO. And then you have the situation, well, what will the EU do if NATO stops basically tacitly supporting? And how long can Ukraine survive? And is it then a question of going to the negotiating table at a point of weakness? And possibly Trump has already forced that by that issue and by that time. And therefore, the EU doesn't really have to acknowledge that, because everything will be decided at some sort of peace conference, which is being forced upon Ukraine, and where they're negotiating from a position of absolute weakness, where they have to give up territory. But that will cause almost a civil war inside Ukraine then, because Zelensky will be out on his ear. There will be very more nationalistic factions, because not in a very right-wing extremist Nazi case as Russia would portray, but people who are so passionate, who've lost numbers of relatives and friends, saying, for what? Are we defending our country, or
Yeah.
are we just prepared to just give it up just because Trump's in as a president? We'll fight to the last person. And
this
so
is this
many
idea
people
that forcing negotiations on Ukraine takes away their agency. Actually, you know, what about, you know, you're assuming that they're not going to have a say in that. Hey, actually, you know, we're still here, guys. Hello, we get to decide. But on the NATO front, I think a couple of important points to make. First of all, NATO themselves have been Trump-proofing their own organization by all accounts, and indeed the EU has been looking at doing this, and NATO have been trying to take things away from the US in terms of organization for support for Ukraine. They, in fact, they wanted to take the Ramstein. So Ramstein is the Ukraine Defense Contact Group of 50 nations that allied together to support Ukraine's defense through provision of weaponry, etc. And actually, it's kind of the ringleader, as you mentioned, is the US, but NATO wanted to take that away from the US in case Trump gets in and it all goes a bit wrong. So there is the idea that these organizations have been kind of Trump-proofing, but also there's an interesting I don't know the answer to this, but I would speculate that I would hope there are checks and balances in the US Department of Defense. So there are enough people. You know, Mark Milley's come out and said, well, Trump's a fascist and unstable, and he was a Joint Chief of Staff. And you have a number of people in the defense hierarchy who there must be throughout the armed forces, people who are not up for isolationism, like they have been brought up in this US at the top of the hegemonic ladder, going around the world, and you know, working to the US's own strategic advantage. Right? This isn't like this is not world police as some people think. This is a US strategy that fits in line with their economic strategy. And if they step back from NATO and if they step back from Ukraine, then actually your defense industry goes down, and your projection of power goes down, and the Department of Defense are going to be, hang on, that's not what we're here for. And so whether there'll be a kickback internally from within the structures of the US Department of Defense against that kind of isolationism, but I don't know.
Well, I suspect, judging from the first presidency, and the second's definitely going to be worse if it does happen. No, because he just replaces anyone who has the temerity to say anything against him. And even you get people like John Bolton, whom you know, I might not agree with his politics, but I certainly agree with a lot of what he said, but was ineffectual, has been far more effectual and outspoken since leaving office. And speaking the truth. But it's like, well, why didn't something get at the time? Why didn't you do something at the time, rather? And that comes from having the executive powers. And if you have control of both houses and the presidency, it's a cult. It's not a political party anymore. I mean, the Republican Party used to be the one that you'd look to for progressive decisions on defense. And under Reagan, you couldn't imagine anything different. And I was a young child under Reagan, and then learning more about it subsequently. And at the time when the US was arguably at the peak of its powers, when the Cold War was won, and a fascinating time in history. But now for that party to be reduced to a cult of almost a maniac, then it's a really sad indictment. And I'm afraid I don't hold any hopes in the weights and powers. I'm afraid if both houses are lost, if someone from the armed forces speaks up against and denounces what Trump is doing or has done, they'll just be replaced. And then there'll be someone eager to take the higher paycheck and the higher rank who will come in and just be silent, to acquiesce. And that's, I'm afraid, how it has been throughout the Republican Party in a 10-year span. And we're talking about Trump, who ostensibly seemed to support the Democrats originally, but just saw an opportunity, much like Boris Johnson with Brexit, I think, to heighten his profile, seek a way into power, and then try to control everyone around him. And he's based himself on Trump to a greater or lesser degree, but I think greater, in that he's surrounded himself with yes men. He's managed to get rid of the people who were going to cause him problems. And somehow the people have bought into this conspiracy theory with some influential people around him, that the whole of the rest of the US and all the offices are against you, the people, or you, the person, and you better vote for me. I'm the only person who can change this. And yeah, I'm really, really scared about what will happen to the armed forces in the US and to the decisions that affect NATO and therefore affect us on this side of the Atlantic. And yeah, Ukraine. So I can't really answer directly Goose's question, going back to the previous question. We'll get on to Mr. Squiggle in a moment. But I really do fear that there will be not a house of cards, but yes, individual countries, as Jonathan mentioned, have been able to make their own decisions, such as the UK, such as the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, have all been really good. And I think at least in the short term, will continue to try to supply Ukraine with what it needs, but it needs an absolutely concerted effort. And it is likely that the only way Ukraine can survive and Russia can be denied what would be termed a victory would be if our defense spending does go up across the board to 3% or higher, with autonomous control, not be controlled by NATO on what you can and cannot spend on. And like Estonia and Lithuania, I think both of them, not sure about Latvia, have a special part of the budget now that is deemed specifically for Ukraine. And Denmark's example is really good, to invest in the Ukrainian economy as part of its defense spending. And I think France is going to do that as well, hopefully. So there are certain signs, but we should have been doing this 2-3 years ago. We shouldn't even be in this.
Yeah, and I think all of those little elements that, I mean, so the defense capacity in Europe has been ramped up, and this is like turning an oil tank. It takes a long time, and yeah, you know, it wasn't ideal, but it is working. And actually, you're starting to see this increased artillery ammunition coming through. Then you've got the Czech initiative, but as you mentioned, you've got a number of countries that have started investing in, and I talk about this all the time on my channel, but you've got a number of countries investing in the defense industry in Ukraine. And again, that's a long-term thing, and it's not just charity. They will get stuff out of doing that. There is a return on investment you get in terms of receiving technology and know-how and knowledge. The will have your own defense, national security, etc. So there's an awful lot of structural things taking place. Again, you know, some of the quick fixes, like lifting restrictions on you deep into Russia, that isn't happening. You're like, come on, we need some of these quick, easy fixes to really help the Ukrainians. And I think that actually, so I don't think that the US will be able to pull out of NATO. I think they put things in place to stop Trump being able to do that unilaterally. But what they might do is he might order them to stop funding NATO exercises, stop funding the US involvement in certain areas, and then that more of the onus is on the other nations. And then without the massive US involvement, that could really degrade NATO's capabilities and whatnot. So it is certainly worrying, but I think it might be okay initially. And Mr. Squiggle says, hopefully the EU take the attitude of sticking it to the US, let alone Trump. Then they focus on EU weapons production and purchasing EU-made weapons and a lot less American. EU has the mass and goods. I have an awful lot to say to that. Then you have him.
Well, I hope they do.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I'm not sure if you got me. I just had a slight delay on there, but let's go again. So, yeah, I mean, in some respects, yeah, I hope the EU does plough its own furrow. I hope Britain does plough its own furrow under a collective that isn't beholden to the US and what the US does. And a certain amount of autonomy is always to be welcomed. And my one hope for the US, if Trump is elected, is that Iran seems to be trying to assassinate him. Now, that can't go down very well. And with Iran inextricably linked to Russia and being inextricably linked to Hezbollah and Hamas funding them, that hopefully Trump might be convinced that actually, you know what, defending the US and helping to defeat Russia and Iran to preserve our safety in the US might actually be a good thing. So that's my hope, that if it all goes wrong in early November, gosh, less than a month's time now, isn't it? 3 weeks or so. There might still be a silver lining in there, and someone might be able to batter some sense into Trump. Yeah, I agree with Mr. Squiggle that EU weapons production has been ramped up, is looking a lot better. Our supply lines to Ukraine are improving, but not quickly enough. But let's just have a look at how Ukraine's defense industry has changed, Jonathan, since February 2022. Who could have imagined the capacity that they have now for producing drones, for producing their own unmanned long-range weapon system, hybrid drone missile? And war does that. And I remember my parents and grandparents saying, you know, the changes that happened in the Second World War, the immense developments that happened. And I think we have to now accept we're at a war. We're on the fringes of a war in the West, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, but we are in a war, be it a hybrid war, whatever you want to call it. It's the starting of a war. I don't think it will escalate into an outright worldwide conflict. That is a possibility, but I don't think it will happen. But I think we need to take on a war setting now and to educate the people, to say why we're doing it, because the only way to stop things getting worse is through a strong defense. Putin never attacks when he is up against an opponent that is well prepared and well armed. He takes weaklings that he thinks won't have any support. We let him walk into Crimea, Georgia, East Ukraine, and we're in danger of letting him take as much of Ukraine as he wants or that he currently occupies for the long term as well. So my message would be, if anyone was listening, if I was advising any governments now, all of us independently have to educate our public. Unpopular decisions, difficult in democracy, but to be united and say we have to spend heavily on defense now, because if we don't, there could be catastrophic implications for us in trying to defend some of our allies, trying to defend the charter in NATO for whichever country is attacked, and there will be more than just hybrid attacks, particularly probably on the Baltic states. So investment in defense now is crucial, no matter what other aspects of society need investment and are struggling in any of the Western collective countries. And I know there are problems throughout post-COVID and recessions, but I think defense, the number one thing of any government, of any leader, is to protect the people, and that's what it's come down to now. So put us on a semi-war footing, educate the people, ramp up defense spending, and then when things calm down, then we can take the peace dividend again, because at the moment we're throwing away the peace dividend. We've done nothing collectively for 20 years, whilst Putin has been building up himself and his armies.
Cool. You're back. Can you hear me all right? I lost.
I can. I don't know what happened there.
I think my internet has gone a bit nuts, so that must be a local thing to me. So apologies to the viewers about that. So I don't know where you got to at the end then, but I think I got the gist. So my view is that the that the EU, they released their military strategy some time back. I reported about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more, where they said 60% of what they make has to be procured from within the EU, which is really, really important for them from an industrial point of view, from an economic point of view, as well as their own military kind of security. Like, if we make it, then we can secure, like, we're not dependent on the third party. So that's not good for the US. And you get this situation where, from a geopolitical point of view, you've got the US looking at the EU and wondering whether EU are a competitor or an ally. And with the transactional nature of Trump, he's going to be looking at the EU much more as a competitor, which is why he wanted the EU to be broken up in the same way that Putin did, right? So Trump looks at the EU and says the UK needs to be out of the EU. That's why he was a proponent of Brexit, and so that then breaks up the strength of the EU, and then the US is in the power position to be able to overcome competitive threats from the EU as this trade bloc, and then it looks at China and BRICS, and Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then looks at them in similar kind of way, or he would. And so the EU is this large trade bloc that has a lot of power, and it needs to work out what it needs to do in these kind of same contexts. And it's better to be allied with the US against all of these other, like, who really are competitors, like competitors to they're competing for your security, if you like. But support their own defense industry much more avidly, and that's why that strategy was sensible. So I think that, like, it's in the EU's best interest to become much more independent from the US, whilst also maintaining a relationship with the US that's really beneficial for both sides. So alliances are a positive sum games. The US won't be able to do things in the world on their own. They need EU countries and UK and Japan and Australia to help them around the world in the Indo-Pacific. If they want to project their power across the world and get a return on investment for doing that in terms of trade deals and its soft power and et cetera, then, like, the isolationist view of Trump is just insane for the US, in my opinion. And I think that while it's kind of, you could see the EU sticking it to the US, it's actually not much sticking it to the US, but just becoming more self-reliant, more independent, and then working with the US going forward in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with everything you said and what Mr. Squiggle said as well. One thing I would say about Trump's isolationist trait, shall we say, and trying to split up rivals, similar to how Trump has done, but his rivals are actually his allies. I think that BRICS has grown, or is threatening to grow, to such an extent now that US and Trump may be concerned about that and may see that, well, I thought we were friends with India. I thought we were friends with South Africa. I thought we were friends with Brazil. I thought we were friends with Russia. I've got all these great relations. And then there's Iran and China, and they've all got together. And where are we? And suddenly our army isn't as big as China's, let alone all of these put together. Our missiles production isn't as big as all these put together. And maybe, again, it's a way of actually saying, you know what, you can't exist on your own. US may have been the world's policeman at one point, but now you're in danger, and now we need a collective. So, I mean, that's all for a future discussion, I guess, and it's hypothetical at the moment anyway. But that's one of the big things that has changed with regard to the geopolitical nature of things since Trump was last in office, and hopefully the last time ever that he was in office, as I'll in my colours to the mast if people haven't already guessed, because I think there is a danger to world order and world security, and I've been quite happy with world security since 1945 up to this point.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So yeah, I agree with Mr. Squirrel.
And actually, you know, BRICS, some people laugh at BRICS because they've attempted to be this alternative to the kind of Western hegemony and providing an alternative to the dollar as the international currency of trade. But actually, the BRICS worry isn't about what BRICS is like now and the fact that they want Saudi Arabia and Zimbabwe and Turkey even want to join them. It's about where BRICS might be in 50 years' time. So it's about long-term planning. And we should be worried about BRICS because BRICS is a potential threat, and it's a growing threat. There is, they don't all get on with each other. And there's this really uneasy alliance between Russia, India, and China, for example. They are marriages of convenience going on there rather than true ideological commonalities. So, yeah, there are lots of weaknesses, and BRICS is a bit crap for X and Y and Z reasons, but also BRICS is a real potential threat going forward if you're talking on a 50-year scale, especially when Turkey, who are the crossroads of the world in terms of trade, culture, religion, etc., are thinking.
That's the real worry, Jonathan. When you've got a NATO member joining a rival opposition attempt to seize global power, and that's what it is, as you say, to eradicate the power of the dollar, to form an alternative alliance that already many of the members, the leading members of, are militarily in alliance with each other. And you know, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, seeing that South Africa, Brazil, India might contribute or be contributing to that alliance as well militarily down the line. So it is a huge threat to the stable world order that we've seen.
I think Goose Springsteen again. To what extent is Ukraine unfairly sharing the burden of the war internally? I have a friend who works in TV, and there are a lot of fighting age men in front and behind the camera making dramas. And this is the whole mobilization and volunteer situation, whether there's corruption involved with people not joining, etc., etc. Do you have any opinions on that, Tim?
Yeah, there is corruption, and I think such was the nationalistic fervor and such was the wave of people who volunteered of all ages. I know people whose some of my friends' fathers in their late 50s, 60s even, volunteering, so desperate to help and preserve Ukraine's integrity and to fight off the Russian threat, that conscription wasn't really an issue. But no one expected this to go on for really more than a year, let alone 2 years, now 3 years nearly. So it is now a huge problem. It's caused a lot of division in society in the past, well, particularly at the weekend when I guess that many viewers are aware, but if you're not, the military recruitment arm, shall we say, going around checking for evaders ostensibly, but also people who break the law are likely to be given the ultimatum to either be slung in jail or to join voluntarily the defense forces. And they've been going around to even wedding parties, restaurants, cinemas, shopping malls, Oki and LZ concert, the #1 rock group for a generation in Ukraine. And as people are coming out, checking all the documents, making sure they're not evaders. And that does obviously show that Ukraine needs more manpower. And the defense forces have been very quick to say this morning, after all the bad publicity about that, yeah, well, there's only about 10% go to the front line. We need logisticals, we need drivers, we need ambulance drivers, we need people to shift things around, we need people in offices. It's not all on the front line, but Ukraine needs people, and Ukraine can't call upon North Korean or South Korean or any other people other than a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand volunteers from other countries that we've seen. And therefore, I mean, the call-ups that they've had have not. I'm amazed that people under 25 are exempt. I mean, your prime fighting age is between 20 and 25, and I understand that that's a very, very difficult point because you're still quite wedded to your family, to your parents at that age. You're going through education, quite possibly still in further education, higher education, but to exempt everyone under 25 did seem to me to be a mistake early on. I think while the iron was hot, so to speak, while Zelensky's popularity rating at the time when the war broke out and his personal bravery was up at 90%, I think that was the time you had to change the constitution. And even though you didn't need to use it at that point, make it clear that if this continues for a long time, we're going to need everyone. And that means no exemptions. And let's reduce the conscription age now to 20 or 18 or 21, something like that. And so the fear is now that every change is causing huge societal problems and people trying to escape from Ukraine, similar to as we saw from Russia in the early days when their own conscription was announced. So yeah, the problem is, you touched on it earlier, that Ukraine hasn't been able to rotate its best troops often enough, and often this has even been telegraphed by Russia, and when they have rotated, they've suffered some of their heaviest losses, and for whatever reason, that's awful. However it happened, and the rotation hasn't been frequent enough to keep the best troops in best fighting condition, and that's why you do need more people in the army. And as we discussed earlier, Ukraine has a finite resource, and so does Russia, but it doesn't care about their finite resource because still they haven't had to tap into St. Petersburg and Moscow yet, the two areas that would change the effect of the nation.
I do apologize if halfway through what you said I was looking blankly because everything keeps cutting out for me. My internet seems to be getting mental, but such is life. Johnny Christensen, thank you for your super sticker, by the way, mate. I really appreciate that. Right, Julian Roster has a question, and thank you for your support, Julian. Always a great supporter of the channel. Do you think the media, especially in the West, has done enough to keep the conflict in people's minds and highlighting the heinous acts Russia has committed on a daily basis? And I'll add to that this quote from Istabrak. In light of the Russian POW executions, why should Ukrainian soldiers continue to adhere to warfare conventions? This is a different question, but we can talk about that. Russian soldiers are knowingly flouting the Geneva Convention with no repercussions. But yeah, do you think the media, especially in the West, has done enough to keep this conflict in people's minds?
Well, as someone who's worked in the media since I was 16 years of age and being an editor in radio stations, I know how difficult it is. And also having been in Ukraine during the conflict prior to 2022, people just used to turn off on their own channels, mentally at least, because they used to get the statistics every day. They used to get the update on the front line every day. And it just meant nothing to people. It's just numbers. And we're similar to that now, even when we look at the daily numbers of Russian losses and we're thinking, God, these are insane numbers, but you don't actually think of the person effect, the families that are involved. So you keep repeating something in the media just as a matter of course, and it loses all effect. And so I do understand why it's not in the media until there's a big development. But I think it's up to the media. I think it's up to the politicians primarily to make those talking points and for more to be made about, coming on to the second contributor, the executions, and they have to be highlighted in the news all the time. And then questions have to be asked and raised at the UN and raised with our leaders, our PM directly. We can all write to our MPs and say, why has Britain done nothing? Why has nothing been said about these executions, all the last lot, all the latest 7. Why are we doing nothing as a nation? Why is the UN doing nothing when the Geneva Conventions have clearly been flouted and myriad war crimes? And by the way, what is the ICC doing? Why has no one spoke to Karim Khan about this and seen if they're investigating and what the process is? And media could keep it as an interesting story, because if you just repeat the figures and just say Ukraine's lost another 3 villages today, people aren't interested. It's a faraway land still to a lot of people. It doesn't affect their daily lives. People who are going through trauma of their own bereavements, their own problems with health within families, with financial issues, doesn't mean anything to them. But when you say these are war crimes, these are people being executed in cold blood, this is what we are fighting for to avoid happening on our doorstep, and this is what the UN is supposed to stand for and isn't doing so, then you can make stories, then you can make documentaries, then you can make things that grab people's public attention. So unless you can grab people's public attention, that isn't going to make news. And I understand that, disappointing though it is. But there are ways, such as marketing people will find how people get surveys that really mean nothing but promote a brand onto a news just because they've sponsored a survey to be done. You can do the same with creative thinking, and I think that's what our government need to do, and I think that's what the Ukrainian government needs to do abroad. And Zelensky's trip is one way of making sure every time he goes on a trip it gets national media coverage, gets international coverage. So his indefatigability does bring a lot of headlines and a lot of good news, but it doesn't, as I said, we could just be doing so much more on that front, and why the issue, particularly the executions, is not raised and isn't leading a lot of news bulletins around the whole of the EU and the US.
The problem is we do get bored of stuff, right? And news shows, unless they're public service broadcasters, so BBC, PBS in the US, whatever, then they are going to be looking for ratings, and ratings depend on human psyche to a large degree. And so you're not always choosing news articles because they're what people should hear, but you are choosing news articles because they are what they want to hear. And that's why fear sells, unfortunately, and that's why the Daily Mail does so well, etc., etc. Okay, so that when it comes to news, it's not always information and accuracy and like morality, geopolitical strategy. News organizations don't have that first and foremost. First and foremost, they have like profitability, and that will have an effect. But I think there is a normalization, and there is people getting bored of things, and that's like I see it as my job is to keep this in at the forefront of people's minds, because I think it is that important. I'm obsessed with this war because it is A, very morally clear, and B, very bloody important. And so when we see like these soldiers, 16 who were assassinated the other day, another 9 in the Kursk area, like executed in cold blood, then we should be shouting about this from the rafters. And that mainstream media outlets aren't doing this, I think, is a travesty, because that would definitely, you can actually use that really positively to generate public outrage against Russia and therefore support for Ukraine. So it's kind of frustrating. Just on the point, and actually, so this is an interesting point. I would disagree, right? So as difficult as it is, Ukraine have to maintain the moral high ground. What is the point of killing? It's so difficult for Ukrainian soldiers knowing that these people have executed their own in cold blood, and it would be very easy for them to return the favor, right? But actually, as soon as you lose the moral high ground, not only do you lose that righteousness, but you also lose support from the West, and that's a dangerous thing. If you get Russian drone footage escaping into the information spaces of Ukrainian soldiers executing Russian POWs, you will stop getting support. It won't matter that the Russians have done it 10 times more, because the Russians are 10 times better at spreading disinformation, right? So that will get into public information spaces, and you lose literally military support. It's an absolute, should never happen.
Yeah, you lose public support as well, because the average person in Texas, North Carolina, even Washington State, for instance, will just, well, both sides are at it. And it's that really hurts me. And it's that even now people, well, both sides are corrupt. Well, yeah, I'm not going to say Ukraine is whiter than white, but the scale of corruption and the scale of fascism in the Russian government has reached levels that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. And yet there are some corrupt individuals and very bad individuals in Ukraine, and they are still in high places in power in certain aspects of society. And I want that to change. But we've made some progress since 2014, since the Revolution of Dignity, the Euromaidan that people may know it better by. But it's not perfect. But you mentioned a juggernaut turning or a super tanker turning. It does take time, and people in positions of power don't vote turkeys for Christmas, so they're going to be holding on and trying to again surround themselves with another level of bureaucracy and corruption that can be in the way first and take the heat. So we're getting there, and it might have been a lot quicker had we not had this 3 years of war. Maybe not, who knows? Zelensky didn't seem particularly keen on exposing corruption, but latterly seems to have done something about it, but only in certain aspects. There are certain alliances that still need to be broken down in that regard. So completely agree with what you said. To why shouldn't Ukraine just do what Russia does? Because it would work against them ultimately in the eyes of the people, and it's the people. We live in democracies, you know, all the good guys are democracies. We are willing to be put to the test, and some of our elections recently have come close to losing to extremism in the EU. And you might argue extremism in the US might be about to take over. And it's that we need to fight against, to defend our democracy, but at the same time, make sure that our education is good enough to tell people exactly why it's important to vote for people that we perceive as the good guys and why they are the good guys.
Yeah. Yeah. Goose Springsteen again, and goodness me, thank you very much for your support. When people talk about Russian economic collapse, I think of the Adam Smith quote, "There's much ruin in a nation." I fear those economic consequences will not be soon enough for Ukraine if that's 2026 plus. So there's this, like we talked about earlier, these very immediate needs, lifting restrictions on missile use, but also the very long-term things being put in place by the West, such as ramping up ammunition production and ramping up weapons production to help Ukraine and investing in Ukraine's economic defense industry. So there are long and short-term things, but this is also in the context of Zelensky now presenting his victory plan. So maybe this is a time to talk about the victory plan, whatever it may be, but he is presenting that to the general public this week. And I don't know if this is like moving. I've said previously that I think we're moving to the beginning of the end phase of the war, possibly, where actually lots of people are thinking, well, this can't go on till 2026 plus. We need to start wrapping this up. And unfortunately, that pushes Ukraine towards something they might not want to do or might not be ready to do. So it'd be interesting to see what this victory plan is made of, and whether it has the granular detail, whether it's more general. But anyway, what are your thoughts?
I like that quote, and it's very astute. And Goose, hats off to you. And yes, thank you for your generosity as well, because trying to defend the nation as Putin would have it, but he's trying to defend himself, and the nation is collapsing. There is no investment in the people, in society. All the investment is going into the war footing, and that eventually means more floods, bridges collapsing, pipes bursting, nothing being replaced. Every single facet of living in Russia will get worse for these people, as well as the sky-high prices, and that will cause eventually resentment that will spill over. But yeah, it's not going to come soon enough, I don't think, either, if the war is brought to what I would call a premature and unsatisfactory conclusion. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants people dying. Nobody wants war. Ukraine didn't ask for this war. Ukraine didn't believe. Zelensky was naive enough to think it wouldn't happen, even when all intelligence and allies were telling him it would happen. Various mistakes have been made along the way. Firstly, when the alliances knew that it was going to happen, I think a no-fly zone should have been put in place, that Ukraine should have asked for it as a preventive measure just for a few days to make sure that Russia didn't invade. That might have only forestalled it anyway, because when the no-fly zone ended, maybe Russia would have attacked anyway. But it would have been a sign that we were prepared to put our planes into Ukrainian territory, sovereign Ukrainian territory, not going over any borders, Belarus or Russia, just to defend and say, we are here and we are not going to move. And you set one troop, one paratrooper, one plane into this area, and you are going to get blasted, just like Turkey blasted one of your planes out of the sky when you tried to buzz them a few years ago. However, those days are long gone. Now, Yet how quickly Russia will come to ruin depends on so many things, and some of it can be pure chance. And we look back at how the Soviet Union collapsed, and it came as a huge shock to all of us, even the most close experts who were saying they're in a bit of trouble here. And after the Afghanistan war, where their losses were minute compared to what they are now, there were still people who didn't think it was going to collapse, and how quickly it came to collapse, and how quickly the Baltic states and others seized upon that opportunity to express themselves and make their bid for freedom. And by supporting them, it undermined Gorbachev and it undermined the Soviet Union. And the whole thing came down like a pack of cards. It may happen extremely quickly again. And I think we're duty bound, I hope, in your heart, we talked about morality earlier, to do that, to keep fighting in any way that we can, by helping media, by supporting Jonathan's channel, by supporting the prominent voices on Twitter or whatever, and supporting directly into Ukraine's funds. Because to be pressured into an unsatisfactory peace deal is basically just giving in to a bully. And I've said it countless times. Name me a dictator who said, you know what, I've had enough of conquering lands. No one's ever said it. They just carry on and on and on till their dying day, until they are stopped. And as Garry Kasparov has said, and as others have said, and recently I published a report from the Helsinki committee and the US diplomats who were behind supporting that, and the chair of that, saying that Russia will not stop until it's stopped. Putin particularly will not stop until it's stopped. But even if the monster is beheaded, another head will grow in a similar fashion, the way things are at the moment. And Russia has to be stopped. And why does saying, okay, we give in, you can have part of Zaporizhia, you can have part of Kherson, you can have part of Kharkiv that you've seized, you can have almost all of Luhansk and most of Donetsk. Front lines there, you've won those. Okay, we'll just give in. How does that help world security? It's the absolute opposite, because then Russia can restock, rearm, it will, and it will go again, either for the whole of Ukraine or for parts of Poland or for parts of the Baltic states. And it's just an absolutely morally corrupt, bankrupt, and ridiculously stupid decision to allow that to happen for the future generation.
We allowed it in Chechnya. We allowed it in Georgia. You know, there are certain areas of Georgia that have been effectively stolen by Russia. You've got Transnistria and Moldova. Do we not learn from history? 2014, Little Green Men. So, yeah, any kind of appeasement of Russia that allows Ukraine, parts of Ukraine, to be partitioned off for Russia, in my books, is just not good enough. And this is what, I'm sorry to go on about this, but this is what really, really pisses me off about Trump, is that I haven't heard him or JD Vance once say that Putin is a dictator and a murderous dictator. I've heard that rhetoric directly from Kamala Harris, who said it the other day. I've heard it from Tim Walz, right? So for one side recognizes, at least, I mean, there's your starting point, recognize that these guys are the bad guys. And instead we've got Trump saying both sides should have a fair deal. What the frick are you talking about? Literally, what are you talking about? That Russia should be entitled to a fair deal here? What does it even mean? Like, you are not giving us the words, the simple words that would illustrate that you understand politically and morally what has been going on in this war. You absolute dolt. So anyway,
I think Jonathan, I mean, I don't know what's going on in his mind, does anybody, even himself, but I suspect I suspect that their raison d'etre, the Trump followers, Trump himself, is that we'll treat them nicely and we'll get a better deal, with no understanding of history, with no understanding of the
but psyche. Your point there is we'll get a better deal. That's exactly it, Tim. Yeah. Right? So Trump's looking at that saying, what's the deal that we can get? Rather, if I was looking at that, I was like, well, okay, you're the guy that's been bullied here. Like, how do I make your life a little bit better here? So, like, what's the deal like for Ukraine? Like, it's all so transactional from a real selfish point of view. For
his presidency, it may well help, but it won't help the next presidency in 4 years' time, when Russia is rearmed and ready to go again and wanting another war, because it sees the West will always give in. And the only time we haven't given in 2 world wars, when the collective West got notable victories The Allies got notable victories, and since then it's been you've got to say that the NATO action in against the genocide that was happening in Serbia and around was decisive action that we wouldn't see the like of today, I don't think, unfortunately, because if people knew there was that threat, if Putin particularly knew there was that threat, we wouldn't be in the state we are now. But giving in will just, I don't see, I think it's about education, as I always bang on about, but I think Putin surrounds himself with voices that do influence him very easily, apparently. And I think somehow we need to make sure that there's some people around him who do understand the truth and can influence him. And John Bolton saying that he just didn't understand and that he couldn't get through to him, but then he'd go and meet someone he deemed as important, like Modi or whatever, and suddenly his whole rationale changed towards India and changed towards, just played like a fiddle by a pariah state, North Korea. It was just laughable how he was just given the runaround by a little fat lad in a country that had a few weapons. That was it. It was just, I mean, what sort of leader is that? Who are you voting for?
Interesting. Thank you very much, BTC Bandit. Really kind, generous of you. And another Goose Springsteen. It's a Goose Springsteen show. And it's not the last one, I can tell you. I'm so disappointed. Look at defense spending in 1990 after the end of the Cold War versus 2024 with a major hot war in Europe. How is it we argue about 2.5% when we should be being 3%? Plus 2 years ago. Now,
democracy. I'm afraid it's elections, it's tax cutting. It's you go into an election. We've just had one in the UK 3 months ago, and saying, I mean, tacitly they kind of both accepted defence had to be strong, but actually telling people, by the way, there's going to be another 1% in your income tax or your national insurance because we have to pay for defence. Defence spending will be 3%. That means everyone's paying 1% extra, and immediately you see your opinion poll rating decline. And you've got to get into power, then take those tough decisions, which will affect your popularity in the opinion polls for a short while. But you can bounce back by proving that your investment was worthwhile. And again, proving that your investment is in your own military, your own production, your own factories, your own jobs and things like that. It comes back again to education, to PR, if you like. But yeah, it should have been a long time ago. We got the war dividend, the peace dividend, and we had our taxes lowered. But we've got to understand that when we've allowed dictators and regimes that are absolutely opposed to freedom, to the US, when they've got into such positions of being able to threaten us militarily, that we do have to dip into our pockets as nations protecting freedom. Freedom isn't free, I'm afraid. We have to pay to protect freedom.
Okay, so this is a really interesting point. I'm probably going to piss off some people here because I know I have some followers who are find tax a prickly subject. But I think it's a really interesting point about tax because we are just afraid, like the Labour Party got in, but they got in on the promise that they weren't going to raise taxes. And really, they have to raise taxes. Like we've got no money in the coffers. We need to raise taxes. But it's important. Like we get really worried. Like I say, political parties get really worried about tax. It's such a prickly subject. But an interesting statistic is this. So I've just got it up here. In 1957, in the UK, we spent 33% of our income on food. That's 1/3 of what we earned, we spent on food. In 2021, we spent 8.7% of our income on food. In other words, life has got a lot cheaper. Like we have more. I know there are lots of very poor people out there who are really struggling on a daily basis, and my generalizations are not going to be speaking for everyone, but just in general, from things like percentages like that, my point is that there is more disposable income. We know that because the shops sell more stuff and things, we can afford microwaves generally and a TV and a mobile phone contract. And we're wondering, do I get insurance for my phone? All these kind of things that we're spending money on this stuff. And but we're spending less money on food. And I think that is an indicator that we probably could afford just a little bit more tax. And if you couch that in terms of like global security, this country's security is going to be in better hand. We will be in a better position to secure ourselves with another 1% on tax here. It's been surveyed before in the UK that our national health service is under a lot of stress, and people would be up for a 1% like tax rise to support the National Health Service, and yet people are afraid to do it. Here we're like on the brink of World War III, and we're still afraid to do that. But as Goose Springsteen says, we need 3%. At the moment, we're moving from 2.32% the UK spending on as a percent of GDP on defence to hopefully 2.5% by 2030. But it needs to be more. So anyway, like, I'm sure people will get angry with that, but we could afford, I think, generally speaking, a bit more tax. When there are more billionaires out there than you can poke a hairy stick at, then I think something needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, kind of we got ourselves into a problem, and politically, let's just concentrate on the UK. It's quite a good case example for this, in that Russia and Belarus did virtually nothing for COVID, and were happy to let people die, conceal the numbers. And it was only Putin himself hiding in the bunker, and then some mild restrictions that happened in Russia for a while. But they just didn't cause their economy to collapse in any way. In fact, I think Belarus is increased because they were able to have more trade and continue the production at full levels of what limited trade they have. Whereas the West, with an incredible action throughout society of being able to support people to not work, was inevitably, we knew it was going to put us in debt for a long time to come, pretty much a generation. And then on top of that, you've got a war. And the Tories did raise taxes a lot, not direct taxation, but a lot of indirect taxation, which was inevitable. We knew that we had to pay back for the COVID years. And then thinking, oh, crikey, as a prime minister, I'm now supposed to increase defence spending as well. Then the public aren't going to buy it. I'm going to get voted out of office, as it happened anyway. The Tories had long gone. They'd made so many mistakes along the way. But yeah, I think that we have to be honest in society. And if we're living in the UK, or if we're living in Ireland, if we're living in the US, you can look at the tax rates of some Nordic nations, Sweden, I think, the actual percentage of tax that you pay as part of your income, and how high it can be, and what you get back as a benefit for that, and whether that's worth it. And people vote with their pockets in elections. But if you say to people, if we don't strengthen defence now, there is an increased chance, maybe not a probability, but it's certainly an increased chance that there'll be conscription at some point in the future, and you'll probably have to go into the army, or your children will have to go into the army or another force, because we're not spending now to strengthen ourselves. So have a think about that. What do you want? Do you want a peaceful, solid, strong, where recruitment in the armed forces is voluntary, but we pay good wages, we recruit people? Or do you want forced conscription because we're on the brink of war?
Just a couple more as we meander towards the close, Tim. Goose Springsteen again. Europe has pursued a separate foreign policy to the USA since Suez in 1956. I think our leaders lack the confidence or mindset to lead, sadly. And actually, this is on top. There was a comment earlier in the live chat that said something along the lines of, we are lacking a leader in Europe. And I think this is something that is potentially the case. So at the beginning of the Ukraine war, you could maybe see Boris Johnson as a bit of a leader for Ukraine. He had his own domestic issues and it was all going a bit wrong back at home. And you could argue that actually he was leaning into his support for Ukraine because it was a distraction for his lack of support at home. But from Ukraine's point of view, he could have been a leader. And then you had Tory leaders in the UK after him that just weren't fit for purpose there for leading Europe, and obviously Brexit. But inside Europe, Olaf Scholz, no, not really. Giorgia Meloni, not quite, although she is coming to the fore. Now, interestingly, we saw Emmanuel Macron, who's always fancied himself as a bit of a kind of central figure, actually start to do a really good job. His rhetoric was in place, and actually there was an awful lot of stuff going on behind the scenes where he was supporting Ukraine a lot. And when he was getting criticized for like phoning Putin and trying to sort out a deal, apparently that was actually because he was asked to do so by Zelensky, which is an interesting nugget, rather than him just trying to be the peacemaker. So I think Macron could have been the person. Then all the elections went all a bit wrong in France. But I think this is definitely the point that definitely a good point, that actually there needs to be a very strong leader in Europe, and I don't think we necessarily have one. Macron could have been one, but yeah.
Well, I agree. I think Boris Johnson was about the best candidate we have. I mean, one of the problems with the EU is that no individual state really wants a leader, whereas NATO, elects a leader that is a compromise candidate often, but I think we've got a good one in Mark Rutte. And coming from a smaller nation, he was never going to be a European figurehead that was noticed so much, but he was a very good leader of the Netherlands for NATO, for the EU, strong, resolute, very clear in his communication. I liked him a lot, and I'm very supportive of his leadership. Maybe he'll be even better than Jens Stoltenberg, whom I also admired, although in different times. And now we do need a different leader, and we've got one for NATO. But yeah, I think the format of having equality, one vote for all, veto, means that within the EU, anyone who wants to put their head above the parapet to be the leader of the EU will soon get shot down and have more enemies than friends. Whereas Britain, extricating itself for right or for wrong, yeah, I think it was for wrong, did have that kind of freedom. And Germany, France, and the UK, when it was in the EU, were the powerhouses and were the ones that could bring others with them. And I know Poland was very closely allied with the UK and the Baltic states because of the strong stance on Russian rhetoric. But it didn't work out. The US has always been seen, because it's an entity that is almost equivalent to the EU in many terms, population, GDP, things like that, that it's much easier for a president to be seen as the leader of the free world, as they love to term themselves. But I would argue that during Trump's time, there were a few people that were capable of being that person who galvanized support. And I think Boris Johnson was one previously. I think Macron is trying to do that without upsetting other rivals. But it needs to be a big nation. You know, even Canada, with respect, a lot of problems that Trudeau has had, but it's not going to be someone that the rest of the world or the rest of the allies would look to as a natural leader. So
yeah, unfortunately, you're quite right. It's got to kind of come from Germany, France, Italy, UK. I mean, not
maybe it's Spain, maybe, but they're not the economic powerhouses, and it's difficult, therefore, to bring that weight to bear unless you have an exceptional figure. And it's potentially Mark Rutte might develop into that in his new role within NATO. And I wish him well. And I think this is the time we need strong characters. And I think, you know, Russia has a strong character for all his faults, and they are manifold. But we need to counter force with force, strong people with strong people, and unity to oppose the division that Putin is trying to cause in both major establishments among the allies, being the Union in Europe and NATO.
And final super chat question, Julian Roster, thank you very much. Brilliant support again. Do you think if the global response to Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 was stronger, would the full-scale invasion ever have happened? Ooh, counterfactual. Recently, it came out that Biden privately criticized Obama for saying and doing very little. Yeah, this came out of Bob Woodward's war book, where and that was really, I think that's revealing, and it shows that there is an acceptance within, in this case, of democratic circles, that actually Obama was weak on the response, was weak to Russia, and that did lay possibly the foundations for him to be able to do what he has done. What are your thoughts,
Julian? Absolutely, 100%. But I think we can go back further than that to 2008, George W. Bush, and the way they rolled over and didn't support Saakashvili anywhere near enough just to get the peace, and just say to, you know, how can a president with Georgia in exactly the same position as Ukraine is now, an ally of NATO, supposedly on a track to joining NATO, how can this nation just be told, sign this peace deal, sign away 2 sections of your territory that is established under the UN as Georgian territory? But it happened. And how did you not foresee that Putin had already made clear his intentions to reunite the Soviet Union under his leadership? How can you then not expect another territorial gain to happen? And when he was a little unsure as to what would happen and sent little green men in, how do we do nothing? One small battalion, one small brigade into peacekeepers into Crimea would have stopped that absolutely, and would probably have forestalled any further ambitions territorially if Putin had been shown there and then that there was no way that NATO or European allies would let that happen. one brigade of peacekeepers sent in, and it could have been asked for before it actually happened, because we knew it was brewing. Intelligence figures knew it was brewing. And yes, Obama, absolutely. And I'm thankful to hear Biden's words. He's been a bit stronger, but not strong enough. But Obama still doesn't admit mistakes. At least David Cameron admits his mistakes, especially when we'd signed, both the US and the UK, the Budapest Memorandum, which they tried to weasel out of. But the wording is pretty clear. We signed to respect and guarantee Ukraine's integrity, and it was just tossed away. And how people don't think that history repeats itself. If you let a bully get away with it, they ain't going to stop. And as I've mentioned previously, we have to stop Putin.
And I think there's a funny, not funny, but there's an irony there that we absolutely excoriate the Biden administration for being anti-escalation, and their escalation management being very sort of kowtowing to the strongman. But actually, the Biden administration of those, if you're talking about Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine in 2014, it's only the Biden administration that actually went, hang on, we ain't having that, and has put in place a massive array of allies. And where we forget or maybe don't realize where the US has done a phenomenal job, and it's a really difficult job that needs continual work, is with the Treasury working on sanctions. Now, the US is doing so much in terms of sanctions and trying to play whack-a-mole with loopholes here, and it's very difficult. But the war against Russia is a war that is happening on the battlefield, in the information spaces, in the cyber spaces, and also in the economic spaces and political spaces. And sanctions, America, I think, has been very, very strong on those. But yeah, so we can criticize Biden, but Biden didn't just allow, and rightly so.
True, but Jonathan, just pick up on one point, if I may. Sorry there, because we discussed Chechnya, we discussed Georgia, and Crimea, Donetsk. But on that occasion, the bombs weren't dropping on the capital city of an independent country. Apartment blocks weren't being destroyed. You could argue that Chechnya should be and wanted to be an independent nation at one point. But from a Western point of view, they were, some would even say, disputed territorial lands. I mean, they weren't. They were disputed by Russia and consequently annexed because we did nothing. But when Russia sends planes into the capital city of Kiev to seize Hostomel Airport, to attack the capital city directly, to bomb civilians in their own homes, then that is a different matter. And I think any president that doesn't react, hopefully, will be kicked out of office, because such absolute shock and horror that this was happening. And for us in the UK, and for Germany even closer, for France, a 2 to 3 hour flight away from Kiev, a country that was free, prosperous, following Western values. And if Biden had not reacted, I don't think he reacted strongly enough, but if he'd reacted the same as Obama did in 2014, then it would have just been an absolute disgrace. But I still have my views on Obama in 2014 and David Cameron. But as I said, at least David Cameron, UK PM at the time, has apologized and acknowledged that there was a mistake.
Yeah, and just as we sort of come to an end here, I just want to just run through a couple of comments, but I won't do any commenting on them. I'm just going to leave them here for you guys to think about back at home. Viggo Holmson says, in desperation, Russia is throwing everything from kitchen sinks to stolen toilets to overwhelm and collapse the Ukrainian front lines. Increased attacks on civilians is part of that scenario. Yeah, they are.
Fact check there. They've not given the toilets back. They still have the toilets.
Yeah. And he also adds, although the front will sluggishly freeze in the coming months, barrages of glide bombs, long-distance drones and missiles are likely to increase, targeting infrastructure and population centers alike. So those guided glide bombs are the single biggest threat to Ukraine, and it is what needs to be sorted. And that's why those air bases need to have been taken out. It's why they need air defenses or F-16s or something to shoot down those planes. But
I just need to make a point as well, because I have made this point before on my Twitter feed, but I know you've got a lot of viewers that don't follow me, and you can miss certain posts, obviously. But the disinformation that is being given by the White House through Jake Sullivan and repeated by Joe Biden is disgraceful. That, oh, well, there's no point giving weapons that will reach further into Europe because Russia's already hidden all its planes out of reach of them. I mean, partially, some things have been moved, but these planes do not fire glide bombs from over the Caspian Sea. They cannot. They're too heavy, and they need to be nearer the front lines because they
50
don't have the
kilometers,
range.
70
So
kilometers.
they have to fly into the range where they are able to be taken down by US missiles that Ukraine has permission to fire to. And it just isn't happening. And that's just appalling. We had a report that hasn't been substantiated that Russia themselves put out, a lot of their bloggers, that an F-16 had brought down a plane that had been on a glide bomb mission. That hasn't been added to the statistics of +1 planes yet. We don't know whether that happened or not, but it's certainly something that Russia is fearful of. And it may be that a plane was taken out or crashed for whatever reason, and they thought it was an F-16 or whatever. But Ukraine can take down these bombers either before or after they've released their payload. But if we take down 3, 4, 5 of them, they will stop coming and they'll find another way. And that is how we protect the civilians of particularly Zaporizhia and the region, and Donetsk and the front line, and Kharkiv in the region, and Kupiansk and Sumy region that has been absolutely battered recently. And we're not far now from the artillery and the glide bombs being able to reach Dnipro, which is the 4th biggest city in Ukraine as well, and has previously been almost untouched, having resisted in 2014. It's still a big crisis, and we need to get rid of that ridiculous rule that we can't touch the incoming planes that are bombing civilians.
Yeah, agreed. And I have it's so they were saying, like, 90% of the planes are moved from the air bases. Well, even if that's true, 10% is still there, and that's a viable target. Thank you very much. And also, the ability to shoot them down. I mean, I think the US is allowing them to shoot down. I don't think they're stopping them shooting stuff down as they are flying with their guided glide bombs. But in order to do that, you have to put a Patriot system right next to the border, and that's just massively risky, and you're just going to lose that Patriot because the Orlans and the Zala and the Supercam reconnaissance drones are spotting this stuff. So that's not going to happen. So really, it's about taking the air bases out, and just not allowing that to happen is bloody annoying. Finnish guy says, in both Finland and Sweden, updated instructions will be distributed to people next month. This is how you act when a war or crisis breaks out. Is anything similar being done in other countries? Not that I'm aware of, but is a sign of the times, my friend. It is a sign of the times.
In Moscow, in one of the regions of Moscow recently, they put out information what to do in a nuclear crisis. It didn't say war, but said about a nuclear crisis, now to protect yourself.
Interesting. Marino 4691 says, Meloni, obviously in Italian here, is weakening the democracy in Italy and creating a monopoly of power for her party. She's not enforcing sanctions or for Russia by closing an eye. So we often get this, like, talking out both sides of the mouth. I don't know. I can't speak to that, Marino, but I assume what you're saying is, well, I don't assume it's correct, but interesting view on the Meloni administration there. I wouldn't naturally be aligned to the Brothers of Italy, Forza and La Liga. I think that's a coalition of people that are rather unsavory as far as I'm concerned, but that's my politics. Mr. Squirrel says, cutting funds sounds great, but with what mechanisms? Counter blackmailing. So he's talking about Orban. Counter blackmailing Orban sounds great, but why haven't they done it? This is a real question, or is it the same as the GOP and Ukraine dollar? Okay, right. Sorry, I butchered that question or that statement, but here's my tuppence on this subject. And I've said this before. The problem with Orban, and the same can be said with Turkey, is that they are in the club, right? And they're in the EU and they're in NATO. If you give, or Turkey aren't in the EU, but if you give them the stick and say, the more you punish them, the more you push them away to Russia even more, and then they become overtly just a Russian proxy. And from within the EU, that's deeply problematic because they will also have huge amounts of intelligence. And the same with as NATO members, if you kick them out, they will take their knowledge of NATO weaponry, of NATO doctrine, of NATO X, Y, and Z, and they'll just take that straight to Russia. So this is the problem with taking countries inside a group and becoming in-group members and then becoming problem in-group members, is that the stick ends up pushing them further away, and then you end up having a real serious problem.
Yeah, so you're not in favour of giving Hungary the ultimatum to kick them out then?
I am actually, but don't think it won't come with huge problems.
I think so Turkey is a different issue, but yeah, I would agree. I think it's got to the stage now where you are so ill-aligned, Orban, with EU principles, EU law, that we are going to take a vote if you don't enact A, B, and C.
Yeah, and I think what's happening is NATO is already stopping sharing information with places like Slovakia and Hungary, which is good, and that needs to happen. But
yeah, the Five Eyes has more information than even NATO shares with Germany and France. I can assure you of that. I've been assured.
So for those who don't know, Five Eyes is US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. So they are people who are like, yeah, we're not going to screw each other over. We're best mates. So
basically the old English speaking nations, which is a little bit embarrassing and possibly some
got on
racist
British Empire.
But they are the tried and tested over years. And again, for those who haven't been following this since the first days of the original invasion, there was a reason why the US and the UK were excluded from peace negotiations or ceasefire negotiations known as the Minsk talks, and why Germany and France were allowed to represent Ukraine, because they didn't do a very good job. Ukraine got a really bum deal in that. Poroshenko had its hands tied behind his back, and Russia just continued anyway, didn't adapt any of the resolutions that were passed, most notably handing back control of the borders. So the strong nations, as they were perceived, Russia refused to have on board, and had the weak nations of Europe, the leaders, France and Germany, perceived to be weak by Russia because they wouldn't stand up. And that is exactly what happened. But thankfully, at least France seems to have learned a little bit since then.
Yeah, interesting. Martin Lai says, if North Korean troops appear, will South Korea send troops? No. And my opinion here is that South Korea is almost happy to see North Korea send as much of its stuff to Russia. South Korea are aligned with the US and essentially aligned by proxy with Ukraine, but actually what they want is North Korea to ship all their stuff to Russia. What they don't want, and this is why they said we're going to get involved if this happens. Basically, they said if we know that military technology is coming back and knowledge is coming back from Russia to North Korea, then we're going to, get angsty. So they're not so worried about stuff going to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. They're worried about stuff coming in to kill South Koreans. So that military technology and that swap of maybe nuclear knowledge coming into North Korea, that's what gets them going. So they do have huge stockpiles of weapons, and they can be really super useful for Ukraine if push comes to shove. But I don't know.
They won't send troops. They haven't sent military, but they've been sharing some technology, and they have been sending financial aid and non-destructive aid. And I think it will continue like that. Japan used to be similar, but Japan has become a little bit more strong, shall we say, in the anti-Russian rhetoric, especially because part of their territory is also occupied.
Yeah, the Kuril Islands. Yeah, and Japan are an interesting one because they're also changing their military strategy away from a defensive army to an army, and that means they can export stuff as well. So there's a few things going on there with Japan that is
not entirely popular either. There's some barriers to overcome there for the public as well, because obviously they were on the wrong end of 1945 and the horrendous consequences that the country suffered. But having been allied to the Nazis and fascists of the time, and Germany similarly, it's very easy for us, speaking as British or Americans or Canadians, Australians and French even, to a lesser extent. But how would our mindset be different over 2, 3, 4, 5 generations if we'd suffered the bombing, and particularly the nuclear bombing that the Japanese had, and might we have a different point of view and be slightly more reticent? And the constitution was written in both those nations to preclude that from happening, but it's now been wrote back on in Japan, as you said.
And just so Smith says, Maddow, that's Rachel Maddow, who's an MSNBC contributor, but also written some books. Some people might not like them if they sit on the right side of the political spectrum. Her book Blowout on hydrocarbons and Putin is very, very good, by the way, and I advise people to read that. Anyway, she says, so Smith says, Maddow is talking a lot about historical examples of the rise of fascism in the US and what can be done. First thing is to recognize the signs and what to do. Now, this leads me to just bring people's attention to a book that I haven't read, but that I have bought and I have it in my audiobook library, is Autocracy Inc. by Anne Applebaum, which is the idea that there are these autocratic nations around the world that are aligned with each other and are working in cahoots, if not formally, then very informally. And this is a really growing problem that we need to have a look at. So just check that book out. the final little comment here, Tom Fernby, who might be a British person in Australia, or because this strikes me as if you knew Australia, you would know. I was shocked recently to see Fox News in Australia spout nothing but Russian talking points. So Fox News in Australia is like Fox News in the US, but even worse, actually, to some degree. So it is really Murdoch's like propagandist. It is. Yeah, Fox News America times 5. Sky News in the UK is no longer owned by Murdoch, so that is a lot more centrist. Some people might think Sky News in the UK might be like Fox News, but it's not at all. More like GB News is like Fox News, really. But anyway, that then sparked off a huge chat in the live chat about Fox News in Australia, and so people got a good sense of what's going on there. And just finally, Tim Vermorgan, thank you very much for the ATP Geopolitics memberships. That's really, really kind of you. Thank you for your support of the channel. Really appreciate it. And Paul Gilbert says, I wanted to say something deep and relevant, but I drank a lot of Ukrainian vodka last night, so Slava Ukraini.
Harilka, Paul. You can't call it vodka. Harilka.
Yeah, there you go. You've been told.
If I had a drink with me, I'd say Budma to you. Always enjoy. Ask for Ukrainian Harilka. If the barman doesn't understand your barwoman, then say, okay, it's Ukrainian vodka. Look for the bottle. There's plenty of varieties. Avoid Russian vodka. It will poison you.
I like seeing the odd meme of off licenses in the US, particularly saying we don't stock any Russian drinks here, and yeah, Slava Ukraini. Yeah, I like that. Anyway, thank you very much to the live chat that's been really lively and is always brilliant. It's such a wonderful community here. As far as YouTube channels go, I reckon you guys are the best community ever. And that's why I invest so much time in reading all your comments, because I feel indebted to you guys for being awesome. Tim, thank you. Is there anything that you think we haven't covered here that you think is, well, there's obviously lots, but anything you would like to add?
I just want to restate education. I think we can all have a say in that, because eventually the war will end one way or the other. And the hatred that we all feel for Russia at the moment is understandable. The closer we are to Ukraine, whether we have family, friends, people we've grown to know over the past 2.5 years, there will be that hatred. But hatred doesn't solve anything. Hatred begets hatred. And I think if we look at what happened between the 2 world wars and how the First World War settlement may have contributed largely to the Second World War, I think we have to be very careful. And I think we have to realize that a lot of silent people in Russia may not agree with the war, but are happy just as long as they're not involved and therefore tacitly supporting. And the same happened in Germany with the rise of Hitler. A lot of people stayed silent rather than saying something. And education is the way that we have to help change the world and have to protect our democracies and ensure that we are going to be in a good state moving forward. And it's a greater problem than ever before because of what is happening with the easy accessibility and ability to promote through Fox News and the likes, extremist channels on YouTube and extremist podcasts that have such a high reach now. And the human mind is first designed to be trustworthy. You believe what someone says. If they introduce themselves, you don't question whether that's their real name or whether they really are an airline pilot. But then you're also programmed to be inquiring and distrustful and searching out the truth in things. So that's why conspiracy theories get a lot of traction, a lot of people interested. Do aliens really exist? What happened at Roswell? Have we, is there an underground deep state controlling everything? People like to discuss and engage that. And once they get drawn into that, it becomes ever worse. So we have to invest in education. We have to tell people confidently what is happening, what is right, and why these people are wrong. Finland is absolutely brilliant at teaching media literacy to people from a very, very young age, from what we would call first school. And I think that we need to invest in our education system in that level to try to ensure that people understand right from wrong, understand fake news, understand how they can be drawn into this conspiracy of lunacy, as it is, that causes hatred, that causes the sorts of problems that we've seen in the US, the division in society. We're humans. Do we like peace? Yes. Do we like our fellow brothers and sisters? Yes. If you don't, then you've got no place in a society. I think that Yeah, very good take. Very well done. I'm always impressed how quick you are, Jonathan. But yeah, then, you know, the vast majority of people are good people. The vast majority of people want peace. A lot of people realize you have to fight for peace, hopefully not figuratively. Sadly, in this case, it is. But we need to fight with education as well to teach people why we are doing what we are doing and why we need to ensure that people aren't taken down these stupid rabbit holes of conspiracy theories. And the human mind is right to inquire. I'm a journalist. That is my profession. That is my job. But there are times when you have to call out the scale that it's gone to on completely the wrong side. But thanks to everyone who's contributed today. Jonathan, you do a magnificent job. Really proud to be associated with you and always welcome to come back on and help in any way I can. And thanks to anyone who's bothered following me today as well. But it's been a lively chat. I'm glad to have contributed a little bit more time today than sometimes we're restricted.
Yeah, sorry. Going out. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And that's really great because it's been a long one. Richard Bennett, thank you very much for your memberships. Really, really kind. And I love this. You know, Tim Van Morgan says, I was going to say probably the best live chat so far, but all of them are so good. And you know what? I do love a good chat to the people on here. It's such a great, like the whole community of people supporting Ukraine is fantastic. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate that. And just conspiracy theories, just on that point, they are usually by definition almost the least probable explanation of any set of events. And the fact is, if you're the only person who knows the real truth, you know, keeping these things quiet, like if you really think that the US didn't land on the moon in 1969 and that the entirety of NASA kept that quiet and all their family kept it quiet, like you are believing something that's insanely less probable than the day. I could give you a Bayesian probability analysis of why it is not. But I remember going to Portsmouth Skeptics in the pub. I used to give them talks myself, actually. I've given them about 5 different talks. But one of the talks I went to as a listener was Rob Brotherton talk about conspiracy theories and how that actually you can statistically did his PhD on them. And you can, you know, basically if you believe one, you believe them all. And you'll find that most conspiracy theorists are just, you're susceptible to one, you end up believing them all. And then this is finding its way into political thought as well, and it's fun to believe these things. I remember getting the X-Files Book of the Unexplained when I was younger, and then like, yeah, oh my goodness, and it's exciting. You're an iconoclast, you're going against the prevailing like thought patterns, but actually you're more likely to just be wrong. So just be careful with believing bunkum.
One more thing, Jonathan, I have to say, I love your garb, I love your merch, and I think people should buy more from your site and give a link.
Thanks, mate. It's in the description below. That's really appreciated, mate. Well, look, thanks, Tim. Thanks to everyone else. You are amazing. Take care, y'all, and stay on the line, Tim. And I will be with you, no doubt, soon for other videos, because whatever's in here ends up being vomited out to you guys and goes into your brains directly. So thank you for being there.
Thanks, everyone, for contributing. Thank you, everyone.